Well, thank you very much for... Is the microphone working?
It's on.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and it falls to me, I have to say, at somewhat short notice. There was a degree of barrel scraping, I suspect, in invoking my role here today, but I have had the pleasure of working overseas in international matters within the Anglican Communion, and that therefore gives me a particular interest in our subject. And it's a great pleasure, therefore, to be here today. Also, of course, to be in a parish adorned with another British clergyman, I think, as the rector. And that's all testimony, I think, to the eloquent phrase we've just heard of British civilizational witness, as Milbank so elegantly put it, and we're therefore heirs to that tradition. It's, I think, a great fascination to those of us engaged both with the international church, or who have been, and also aware of the response of academia to the role of religion, and specifically Anglicanism, to think about how that actually works. It's very clear to me that in the establishment of international relations, religion doesn't fit. And I have been present at a number of seminars in which the subject was put on as the theme for the discussion, and they all, as one, decided they would talk about something else, namely civilization or culture, but certainly not religion. So it's particularly interesting to reflect on what ways there are in which religion has caused people to act or not act other than they have, or as they would. And I think there's therefore a further sub-question about that within that, which is an historical question to answer in many ways. In what ways has Anglicanism informed the action of Anglicans internationally? And that, in a sense, is what we are about today. And therefore can be no better way of looking at that question than through an historical lens. And that's why it's particularly appropriate that we have the very distinguished speakers that we have to address us in this particular session. And of course, we're beginning with a very interesting historical figure of whom we are very aware in Britain because of our naval history. And I'm reminded there that he himself was also very much religious, and specifically Episcopalian, because he went from his school days all the way through his life, informed by an Episcopal vision. Indeed, as I recall, it was said by one of his biographers that in a letter at the age of 8, he combined the two themes of the omnipresence of God and the need to have enough fireworks for July the 4th. And that speaks, I think, to someone who's both religiously informed and highly practical. And that brings us, of course, precisely to the gift of Dr. Suzanne Geisler-Bowles, Emeritus Professor of History at William Patterson University in New Jersey, an expert on US colonial and early national history and American religion, author of numerous books, including her most recent volume, God and Sea Power, The Influence of Religion on Alfred Thayer Mahan. Mahan, I should say. I apologize, as you have a different way of saying here. And her doctoral degree in history is from Syracuse University. Therefore, without further ado, I will ask her to take the floor for her allotted 20 minutes. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the plug for my book. I didn't want to carry the whole thing, so I just put the dust jacket. But I wrote this. This book came out in 2015, and it's a study of Mahan's life, religious life particularly. You may start the clock. Okay. Alfred Thayer Mahan, 1840 to 1914, Rear Admiral, United States Navy, though famous in his day, is not well known today. He is still revered in the Navy, and especially also in the Royal Navy, definitely. But apart from naval historians and historians of U.S. foreign policy in the 1890s and early 1900s, most people, including church historians, have never heard of him. I cannot tell you how many times when I started to work on him years ago, and people would come up and say, as they do, "What are you working on?" And I'd say Alfred Thayer Mahan. I'd get blank looks, and who's that? But yet Mahan was world famous in his day, and not solely in naval circles. Though he had previously written a book on naval operations in the Civil War, in which he had served, his fame rested on his book, published in 1890, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783. He was president at that time of the newly founded Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, and his book was a compilation of his lectures on naval history, particularly on the lessons learned from a close examination of how Britain became the world's superpower by having the largest and most proficient navy in the world. This book made him famous and, in effect, gave him a new career as a pundit on military and diplomatic affairs. The book has never been out of print, was translated into numerous languages, and I was just told Chinese is now among them, not surprisingly, and was studied avidly by admirals and politicians of every nation with a navy. Famously, Kaiser Wilhelm II, who actually misunderstood the book's thesis, ordered every officer in his navy to read it. Mahan went on to write 18 more books and dozens of articles. But Mahan had another side to him, and I was really the first one to write about this in a detailed way. He was a devout Christian, and he lived out his faith through an Anglican perspective. At the same time he was writing on naval topics, he was also writing extensively on religious topics. These writings generally took one of three forms: letters to the editor, book reviews, and articles. These appeared in the secular press as well as the religious press. His favorite venue was a New York-based weekly Episcopal magazine, I guess you'd call it, called The Churchman. This was an independent Episcopal publication, meaning independent of the church hierarchy, edited by Silas McBee, a layperson with strong sympathies to the social gospel. Mahan also wrote a book on Christianity, The Harvest Within, in 1909. Mahan's father, Dennis Mahan, was a longtime professor at West Point, and Dennis Mahan had a younger half-brother, Milo, who became an Episcopal priest and was professor of ecclesiastical history at General Theological Seminary in New York City for many years. Both the Mahan brothers were in the circle of friends around William Augustus Muhlenberg, a prominent priest known as the Evangelical Catholic. Alfred attended an Episcopal school and entered Columbia University at 14, during which time he lived with his uncle Milo. And after 2 years at Columbia, Alfred went to the Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland. After graduating in 1859 and then serving in the Union Navy during the Civil War, he began to take religion seriously under guidance from both his mother and his uncle. He also began to read extensively in theology and church history on a post-Civil War 3-year voyage to the Far East on USS Iroquois. The books were all recommended by his uncle and were supplied to him by either his mother or his uncle. In 1871, back in the US and briefly stationed in Boston, he had a dramatic conversion experience in an Episcopal church. He doesn't tell us which one, and he said he never knew the preacher's name, but he wandered. It was during Lent, and he had some free time, and he walked into this church that had a service going on. He had a dramatic conversion based on what the preacher was saying, that Jesus died not to save people not from hell, but from their sins. This had a huge effect. From this point on, Mahan began a new life as very much a born-again Christian, though still very high church in his view of liturgy and the sacraments. He married, fathered 3 children, and got a dog. He continued in a life of prayer, Bible study, and church-going 3 times on Sunday. Okay. Fast forward to 1896, when Mahan, now world famous in naval and military and diplomatic circles, retired from active duty. He now concentrated on writing naval topics, obviously, but also religion. I have a whole chapter on this in my book called A Public Christian. In other words, he was very much in the public square. He was in frequent demand as a speaker, both to church and secular audiences. How did he manifest his Anglicanism in the public square? Let me give you just a couple of examples. One involves just war theory and what was called the arbitration controversy. Ambassador Pham actually referred to this in his talk. It was a huge issue in the day. In the late 1800s or early 1900s, the social gospel movement, the religious wing of that day's progressive movement, was in its heyday and was making inroads into mainline Protestant denominations. Mahan made no bones about his disdain for the social gospel and for the abandonment of the notion of original sin. He disapproved of the social gospel because it reversed the order of the two great commandments by putting love of neighbor above love of God. Original sin he accepted as a doctrine, not only because it was biblical, but because the entire history of the human race demonstrated its reality. A popular movement in intellectual and religious circles of the day was called universal arbitration, I'm just going to call it arbitration for short. This was the notion that war could be abolished if only all international disputes could be arbitrated. If arbitration could be made mandatory, then war could be ended forever, or so it was thought. Connected with this movement was a new kind of pacifism. Traditional pacifism had been around for centuries and was the belief that war was always morally wrong, all wars at any time for any reason. A new type of pacifism, which I call functional pacifism, was very much part and parcel of the social gospel and secular progressivism as well. The functional pacifists did not necessarily believe that all wars fought in the past were wrong. Indeed, some were good, especially, of course, the Civil War, because it resulted in the end of slavery. Indeed, many of these pacifists had personal or family roots in the abolition movement. But they now believed that while war may once have had a moral purpose, that was no longer the case because humanity had morally evolved. War had become, as they liked to say, a relic of the barbarian past. Mahan did not agree with this viewpoint, and he expressed it in various writings, as well as his participation in the Hague Conference in 1899, which I will get back to in a moment. Mahan definitely believed in, as I say, original sin. All humans, with the sole exception of Jesus Christ, are sinful and they do bad things. Violence and war are the result. It is important to grasp that because of his theological views, Mahan did not see human nature as constantly improving, an idea that was a staple of progressive thought. Therefore, he thought that war never could or would be eliminated. This was the basis of his argument with the pacifists. The first Hague Conference was held in May through July 1899, a conference called by Tsar Nicholas II to bring about some sort of universal arbitration agreement, preferably a mandatory one that the various world powers would sign onto. This, of course, would entail setting up an international tribunal to hear cases. The social gospelers and progressives latched onto this notion with great enthusiasm and foresaw an end to war altogether. President William McKinley appointed Mahan to the U.S. delegation. There were 4 other members plus the secretary. The other members were not happy about Mahan's membership on the committee. He was the only member who was against arbitration. The others were keenly for it. Foremost among these was Andrew Dixon White, a diplomat and former president of Cornell University. White kept a diary during the conference. Mahan was frequently mentioned, always in a negative light. White said that Mahan, quote, had very little, if any, sympathy with the main purpose of the conference, unquote. White considered Mahan wedded to old-fashioned militaristic views and admitted to his diary that he was embarrassed, his word, by Mahan's retrograde views, though he conceded that Mahan was, quote, a man of the highest character and of great ability, unquote. The conference did not achieve its goal, and White felt that Mahan was partially to blame for his obstructionism. After he returned home in August 1899, Mahan wrote an article entitled The Peace Conference and the Moral Aspect of War, which appeared in the North American Review. This article was later reprinted in 2 of Mahan's books. Lessons of the War with Spain, 1899, and Some Neglected Aspects of War, 1907. In this article, Mahan maintained that the desire to end war by means of arbitration had a built-in fallacy that its advocates refused to recognize, namely that arbitration itself was a form of coercion. In Mahan's view, arbitration was even worse than war in that it coerces the conscience and binds it ahead of time to unforeseen situations. War, he said, was not a good in itself, but occasionally had achieved good things, which measures short of war could not. One of the biggest fallacies of arbitration, in his view, was this assumption that war was the worst evil. Christianity did not require nations to relinquish the power of the sword, reference to Romans 13:4, and the use of that power was sometimes necessary to prevent a worse evil. This article generated many irate responses from social gospelers and secular progressives. Let me just give you a few quick examples. An attorney named Wallace Rice criticized Mahan and called him a warmonger and a hypocrite for clothing his views in the garb of Christianity. He blamed Mahan's influence for the failure of the peace conference and said, "May God forgive you and lead you to an altered and better mind." Lucia Ames Mead, another anti-imperialist peace advocate, also launched an attack on him. She believed, this is a direct quote, "human nature doubtless is improving," and that war would end within a century. She worried that influential people such as Mahan would derail this process. That Mahan was a publicly professed Christian dismayed her. She acknowledged that he was an exemplary Christian gentleman, but was horrified by his belief that war was inevitable. Sometimes Mahan responded to these attacks in print, sometimes he did not. But he did write in another article called War from the Christian Standpoint, which he wrote in 1907. Well, it was originally a speech he gave to a church group. He stressed the difference between a private individual and the state. This was a very important distinction to his thinking about politics in general, war specifically. Even though he disagreed with pacifism, he affirmed that it was permissible for an individual to hold that stance, as he said, if so led by the Holy Spirit, as it would involve only the surrender of one's own rights. But it was immoral, he thought, for a Christian to surrender the rights of others. Nations were not the same as individuals in that they were specifically tasked by God to protect the lives of their citizens. Hence, those who hold positions in government would be behaving in an immoral way if they turned their personal pacifism into public policy. In another example of Mahan engaging in the public square as a Christian, he came out strongly against the church taking stands on political issues. In 1911, there were several arbitration treaties. See, arbitration comes up again and again in this time period. There were several treaties between the U.S., Britain, and France that were before the U.S. Senate for ratification. Excuse me. A group called the American Peace and Arbitration League was asking clergy of all denominations to observe November 26, 1911 as Unity Sunday and preach sermons urging the ratification of the treaties. The Episcopal Diocese of New York, at its annual meeting earlier that month, passed a resolution urging ratification of the treaties. You won't be surprised to know that Mahan was against this, but his response had nothing to do with the pros and cons of arbitration itself, but rather the suitability of the church's attempting to interfere in the political process. He wrote a long, almost article length, but he wrote it as a letter to the editor, to the New York Times, identical letters to the New York Times and the New York Evening Post. The diocesan resolution and the entire Unity Sunday concept were, in his view, a violation of the scriptural distinction between church and state. His argument was based solely on scripture, not the Constitution. The purpose of the resolution, he said, quote, avowedly is for the church to bring pressure to bear upon the state in the matter of an action which is committed to the state and is not committed to the church. In other words, the church is to be used as an instrument of political agitation, unquote. This was wrong on several levels, he said. As a practical matter, he pointed out that the clergy have no specific expertise in these issues. And even among those who did, career diplomats and so on, they disagreed amongst themselves about the treaties, and so there was no one distinctive Christian position. Mahan then stressed the crucial distinction he wanted to preserve, that between the Christian as individual citizen and the church as an institution. In their capacity as citizens, Christians could participate in the political arena as much as they liked. As citizens, he said, it is not only their privilege, but their right and maybe their duty to do their utmost to forward any measure of public policy that commends itself to their judgment. If the, end quote, if the diocesan convention delegates wish to take a stand on this or any other issue, they should do so as private individuals and not claim to represent the Episcopal Church. I'll sum up this way. Mahan certainly believed and exemplified in his own life that Christians as individuals should engage with the issues of the day and participate in the public square. And they should be guided, as he always tried to be, by their Christian beliefs. But the church as church should not interfere in politics. That would be exceeding their particular function given to them by God. Thank you.
Well, I have to say, Professor Geisler, that you have, Geisler-Bowles, that you've exhibited what I would call supererogatory virtue by managing to say all that you wish to say and do it in less than 20 minutes, which is what you were given.
That was the goal.
From my own experience, I know that brevity takes work and also a great deal of time, so I know how much effort goes into that. I am struck by the hidden hand, in a sense, behind some of these discussions, which I think is highly relevant now to our next two speakers, really. As I was thinking, we had a number of references earlier on to Richard Hooker, and he makes a very clear distinction between, whilst in one sense he's obviously someone who embodies, as C.S. Lewis put it, a concept of the universe and the world as drenched with deity, there's a sense in which he upholds, therefore, a rather classical, and might almost be tempted to say Thomistic notion of the hidden sort of first law, but he also has this notion of a second manifest kind of law, which is manifest through our wrestling with Scripture. And that's the kind of thinking which perhaps one thinks of as influencing history in other ways and at other times. And that rather came to my mind when thinking about what Dr. Paul Marshall is going to talk about, when he discusses the Anglican understanding of the state and the public square, and how that's often been, for him, as he put it, for Anglicans, of a disposition rather than an explicit understanding, something which he sees as working itself out in a contrast between the North American experience after the American Revolution and how it's shaped Canada. Dr. Paul Marshall is someone I've known for quite a long time. We first met, I think, when he was living in the basement of Mrs. Nipper's house here when she was head of IRD. But he has, of course, a very distinguished academic record. He's Senior Fellow of the Hudson Institute Center for Religious Freedom and also the Wilson Distinguished Professor of Religious Freedom, and has published at the Institute, at the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor. And he's the author of more than 20 books and took his degrees from Manchester, Western Ontario, the Institute of Christian Studies, Toronto, and the University of York. It's therefore a very great pleasure, both personally and in terms of what he's going to say, to invite him to speak now.
Thank you very much indeed, Alistair, for that introduction. A conference such as this obviously provokes the question, is there a specifically Anglican political thought or political theology? Of course, that can be asked of any church or secular organizations. But it comes on more strongly with the Church of England because it's a church, part of whose designation is a particular country. It's tied to a place and seeks to embrace a lot of different things going on in there. So finding a unity can be difficult. Richard Hooker or Neville Figgis are often seen as exemplars of Anglican thought, as indeed are several of the speakers at this conference. But I still I have questions about this. Richard Hooker, of course, seen as the exemplar par excellence of Anglican political thinking. But why not John Locke? Also a member of the Church of England, one who spent the last 10 years of his life writing commentaries on the New Testament. Very bad commentaries, I should add. But also the gentleman who's pictured on my left, John Wesley, serialized Locke's essay concerning human understanding in the Arminian magazine, and in fact wrote on Locke himself. So there's perhaps more going on with Locke than what we might think. So that's why led me to say in my sort of brief paragraph on this that are we talking less about particular doctrines or thoughts and perhaps more on an ethos or a sensibility, or to use Michael Oakeshott's expression, a disposition. This came to me, if I may tell a personal story. I've lived in Canada more than I have in any other country. And in the 1980s, Professor Don Smiley, who would not be known here, but was in the Canadian context and international context a very well-known political scientist, decided to teach a course on Canadian political thought. And to my surprise, a book of mine, my first book called Thine is the Kingdom, was on the reading list. And my own thought about this book is it was manifesting the thinking of Dutch Calvinists. But I asked Smiley, I said, why is this book here? And not because I was saying things about Canadian political thought, but he thought it was an example of that. And he said, no, that book is very distinctively Canadian. Says an American would not have written it. So that was a total surprise. I've got others, examples of finding out that what people read seemed to have no connection with what I wrote or what I wrote. But I want to talk a little about this disposition and then its effects in Canada and differences between Canada and the US. We know with the death of Queen Elizabeth, if I may, brings the question of monarchy to light. If I may quote Andrew Sullivan on this, you could make all sorts of solid arguments against a constitutional monarchy. But the point of monarchy is precisely it's not the fruit of an argument. It is not an Enlightenment institution. It is a primordial institution. It has little to do with merit and logic, and everything to do with authority and mystery. Two deeply human needs our modern world has trouble satisfying it. So you have this, the question of memory, which comes before argument, question of inheritance. And if we compare this, and I will quote quite often from the late George Grant, a decidedly Anglican Canadian political philosopher, but commenting on North America, says, all of us who came here, talking about from Europe, made some break in that coming. This majestic continent could not be ours in the old way, because the making of it ours did not go back before the beginning of conscious memory. That is, we have not found ourselves in a place which we inherited and did not make. And Grant wants to explore how this difference in North Americans' different manifestations has played out. So I want to look at some how Canadians understood themselves and the United States. Of course, one of the major shaping influences on English-speaking Canada was the United Empire Loyalists, those who sided with Britain during the American Revolution and moved to Canada after American victory or after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, or perhaps even before then. Amongst them were several thousand Native Americans, particularly Iroquois, and also several thousand black loyalists who often had a very difficult time in Canada. It would be a mistake to see all, or perhaps most of these loyalists as driven by an ideological commitment to the Crown and the Church. But many of them had that. Others came in the 1790s because taxes in Canada were much lower than in the United States, perhaps 1/4. Those were the days. So 80 years later, many moved back to the United States for greater economic prosperity, so that greater than 10% of the population of New England, their ancestors came from Canada's maritime provinces. But by the time of the War of 1812, about 75% of English-speaking Canadians had come from the United States, and they shaped Canadian culture. And what was close to them was a rejection of republicanism and a loyalty to the Anglican Church. And I think it can be argued that their ties still with Britain and their antipathy to the United States provided the strength needed to keep Canada independent and distinct in North America. Indeed, the province of Ontario, on its coat of arms, it's in Latin, but I'll just read the translation. On its coat of arms is you'll find the words, "Loyal she began, loyal she remains." If you can find more than 10 Ontarians who know that, I would be surprised. But with the Loyalists and others, often it was not clear about what they wanted, but it was much clearer what they didn't want. In terms of what they wanted, to quote Grant again, it was an inchoate desire to build, in these cold and forbidding regions, a society with a greater sense of order and restraint than freedom-loving Republicans would allow. It was no better defined than a kind of suspicion that those in Canada could be less lawless and have a greater sense of propriety than the United States. On the negative side, what they didn't want, Canadian national self-understanding could have been, well, we're not sure what we wish, but we do know we are not Americans. We are not Republicans, and we did not rebel and did not seek to constitute a new polity. In looking back at the United States, in general, the US was regarded as perhaps too big, too unmanageable, and too violent. Even into the 20th century, Canadian newspapers used phases of social and political life in the United States either as horrible examples to be avoided or sometimes as useful patterns to be followed, but mainly as horrible examples to be avoided. Going back historically, one of the fathers of Canadian Federation, D'Arcy McGee, who was Irish and took part in Irish rebellions seeking for independence for Ireland, fled Ireland ahead of, before he was arrested by the British, went to the United States, and then became a fervent monarchist and moved to Canada. And became, people had said, in some senses, the first Canadian nationalism. He was also assassinated. But McGee, referring to Americans, says, as rebels against authority, they found it impossible to claim a due portion in the new constitutions for authority. They could not assert the divine origin of government, the natural right of man to be governed, the virtue of civil obedience, and all the other ethical truths which must, every one of them, enter into any human system that ever expects to merit the blessings of divine providence. And again, this stress that democracy, or too much democracy, and self-assertion leads to impiety. In 1905, Canadian Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier, during debates in the House of Commons about Canadian schools, said, We live by the side of a nation in whose schools, for fear that Christian dogmas in which all do not believe might be taught, then Christian morals are not taught. When I observe in this country of ours a total absence of lynchings and an almost total absence of divorces and murders, I thank heaven that we are living in a country where the young children of the land are taught Christian morals and Christian dogmas. So, even for those who found much more to admire in the US system, there still remained the repeated and overwhelming fact of slavery. As Bishop Mountain stated, in looking at the United States, slavery was a monstrous anomaly, the political contradiction unsurpassed, or rather unequaled in the world, in a state that vaunts itself aloud to the world as a bastion of freedom. To summarize these views, David Putter's book, a book-length survey of Canadian views of the United States, concludes, fundamentally, what Canadians sensed was that their culture and their system still largely accepted the principle of authority, while American society and the American system did not accept this principle in any comparable degree. Canadians believed that the state, through some authority, should provide moral direction for the society it governed. And moral direction meant discipline, order, responsibility, obedience, and even inhibition. Obviously, America has believed in discipline, order, responsibility, and the rest, but has tended to believe them more as self-imposed through the acceptance of a Protestant ethic rather than imposed by public authority. So, with the sort of core cultural pattern of English Canada, I stress, here I'm only trying to summarize English Canada. Coming from the Empire Loyalists and their roots, you get two very different sort of ethoses across the 49th parallel and across the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence. And I think there are a million other factors, but I think this is one of the major reasons for the continuing distinctions of these two countries, though the differences under the influence of the Trudeaus are rapidly disappearing. In response to this sort of critique of American overstress on freedom and understress on authority, George Grant says this about American conservatives who would process, there's much more in this country than the Enlightenment. There is some truth in the claim of American conservatives. Their society does preserve constitutional government and respect for the legal rights of individuals in a way that the Eastern tyrannies, here talking about the Soviet Union and China and elsewhere, do not. The perpetuation of this government in this respect depends on the continuing tradition of Lockean liberalism amongst influential classes. Bourgeois Protestantism, with its Catholic and Jewish imitations, has survived in the United States and given some sense of the eternal to many people. Nevertheless, here's an integralist before his time, 60 years ago. Nevertheless, these traditions are no longer the heart of American civilization, becoming much more residual every year. Skeptical liberalism has become increasingly the dominant ideology of those who shape society, and this ideology becomes the extreme form of progressive modernity. There are still old and settled legal institutions in both Canada and the United States which bring forth loyalty from many of the best practical people. But to quote Richard Newhouse's summary, but we do not have the tradition of thought which can revitalize for our time the truths from which those institutions emerged. Thank you very much.
Well, once again, Dr. Marshall, you've exhibited supererogatory virtue and are thus affording us a lot of time, I presume, for wider discussion, which your remarks will certainly, I think, provoke. And that, of course, now brings us to our third speaker, whose thesis addresses specifically, I think, the differences between, well, the features that make the American experience unique, which have also been highlighted in a sense from the contrast with Canada, as we've just heard. Dr. Miles Smith is Assistant Professor of History at Hillsdale College, and his expertise is in U.S. Southern history and the Atlantic world, and he's a contributor to many sources outside the purely academic, and the Gospel Coalition, the Federalist, and he took his degrees originally from the College of Charleston, the Citadel, and Texas Christian University. And he will enlighten us as to the sense in which, despite disestablishment, the Anglican Church, or the Episcopalian Church, retained a strong sense of political engagement, which might not have been expected, and thus resisted, in a sense, the pull of secularism, at least in the first place. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I'm thrilled because I get to complain, as is the custom of most historians. And I'm a little worried because what I want to complain about is what I'm going to call Virginia imperialism of the disestablishment discussion. And I'm a bit worried because I'm in earshot of Virginia today. What I want to propose to you is that the sort of we've litigated disestablishment overwhelmingly through Virginia. There wasn't just one, of course, disestablishment. There were 13 of a sort. Actually, there weren't 13. Some of the colonies didn't have established churches, but we've tended to take Virginia's story and apply it to the rest of the republic that's formed when the Constitution's promulgated. So I want to push back on that a bit, and I won't belabor the point about Virginia. I used to live there. I owned property in Virginia on an old glebe that was rendered from the city of Norfolk's St. Paul Parish. So if any of you have family history there, it's not my fault. You can blame Jefferson. Episcopal seminarians gathered with their teachers on July 1st, 1836, to hear the commencement address of the General Theological Seminary. The speaker for the day, Bishop Nathaniel Bowen of South Carolina, hailed originally from Boston but grew up in the Carolina Low Country after being orphaned as a child. The first Episcopal bishop of South Carolina, Robert Smith, oversaw Bowen's upbringing. Bowen understood that he spoke to seminarians of a new and truly national church. His lecture that day was, quote, on the peculiarity of the circumstances of the ministry in the United States and the character which it imperiously demands, end quote. Anglicanism, or the Church of England, had been the established church of a majority of the colonies. The American Revolution and disestablishment soured citizens of the United States on connections with the English Church. After 1789, of course, American Anglicans had the ecclesiastical quirk of being consecrated through the succession of the Scottish Episcopal Church instead of the churches of England or Ireland. But nonetheless, Anglicanism remained a vital, influential part of the Protestant intellectual, social, and political traditions in the United States. Bowen understood that seminarians needed to understand something particular about being Anglican rectors in the United States, and his speech illustrated the limits to which Anglicanisms fully committed themselves to the Constitution's religious settlement. Disestablishment did not fundamentally change Anglican churches' relationship to the civil order or their socio-political engagement in the early Republic United States, or what passed for political theology among Anglicans in the era. Bishops, priests, and lay people remained committed to robust interaction between church and state within the disestablished order. The absence of state churches was not, for North American Anglicans, a harbinger of societal or even state-sponsored secularization of the public square. During the 1780s, disestablishment in Virginia and the promulgation of the Constitution of the United States led to a robust debate over church and state throughout the American Republic. In states ranging from New York to Delaware to South Carolina, A de jure Anglican establishment sustained a broadly Protestant social order that guarded society from perceived radicalism in the form of Roman Catholicism or certain dissenting sects. Conceptions of morality rendered from historic Anglicanism through the mediums of the 1611 Authorized Bible and also the Book of Common Prayer sustained what Evan Heifley has called a tradition of moral Protestant establishment, particularly in the Middle States. Blasphemy laws and laws that regulated sexuality along historically Protestant lines remained in force. Divorce was tightly regulated or illegal. Some states, like North Carolina, retained strict anti-Catholic provisions in their constitutions well into the 1830s. Anglican political theology, or I should say what passed for Anglican political theology in the United States, differed from its more churchly brothers in Great Britain and Ireland. A dearth of bishops and clergymen in 18th century North America meant that new American Episcopalians, especially those outside of New England and New York, developed a tradition whereby vestries exercised outsized influence compared to their British and Irish counterparts. Soft Protestant socio-legal establishments developed in the early Republic, therefore, because many local elites, often Anglican vestrymen, wrote colonial moral and religious precepts into the laws of their newly independent states and into their newly independent states' constitutions. Histories have routinely underplayed the enduring legacy and influence of Anglican clergy and laymen on American laws and society in the early Republic. Evangelical scholars, for example, understandably saw the rise of so-called evangelicalism as a triumph of democratized religion over older, more formalistic forms of American and admittedly less democratic forms of Protestantism. But it would be wrong to assume that the rise of evangelicals, particularly Baptists, Methodists, and perhaps to a lesser degree Presbyterians, rendered Episcopalians powerless or even less influential in the broader Protestant order that they created. If anything, it was the enduring power and influence of Anglican clergy that made Thomas Jefferson so aggressively committed to getting his version of his disestablishment done quickly. When, in the middle of the 1780s, Anglicans asked for what Protestant churches had been led to expect from the new republic, relative church independence from the state, control of their own property, and maintenance of the ecclesiastical hierarchy independent of the Commonwealth, Jefferson claimed that Anglicans were trying to maintain a state establishment, a la the old Erastianism of the early Reformation. Patrick Henry, no fan of the British regime himself, balked at Jefferson's moves against the Anglican hierarchy, which Jefferson said was using the new constitutional era to show their teeth and fangs. The political success of disestablishment and the numerical growth of its obvious beneficiaries, Baptists and Methodists, obscured the continuing commitment of Anglicans and subsequently Episcopalians to the close relationship between church and state that Americans believed could endure in a disestablished religious order. Disestablishment also obscured the prevalence of Anglicans in high office and their relatively large numbers in high office. George Washington, of course, an Anglican vestryman, broadly affirmed disestablishment, but broke with Jefferson and Madison on the idea that, quote, disestablishment was a necessary consequence of religious liberty, end quote. The first president held, both in principle and in practice, that, according to Michael Novak, for example, government ought to endorse religious seriousness in general, since a long-lived republic depended on a virtuous citizenry. Washington also believed that government should, quote, rightly accommodate itself to the claims of conscience in various religious bodies in a manner consistent with common good and public order. It's common to note that Washington did not take communion, and his relationship with religion has, of course, been litigated too many times to count. But on the question of religion and the state, he affirmed the long-time understanding among Protestants, and particularly Anglicans, that church and state both played a role in upholding civil society, and that they could and should cooperate in doing so. The more extreme disestablishmentarianism of Jefferson and Madison, for example, their version meant that churches weren't able to incorporate in Virginia, and they weren't able to incorporate again until the early 21st century, by the way. Their views did not exhaust the range of the founders' thinking about church and state, and their views were far more narrow than Washington's. Anglican vestrymen like Washington and other practicing Anglican laymen in the federal Congress and state legislatures implemented the constitutional religious milieu of the 1780s, but generally without Virginia's particularly aggressive disposition to de-church the political and social realm. The Old Dominion's en masse secularization was an anomaly, and other states allowed a wide variety of privileges for Episcopal churches to remain in place. Even the retention of property, for example, served as a vehicle for Episcopalians in New York City and New York State to exercise a disproportionate influence politically and socially well into the 19th century because of their wealth and real estate holdings. New York City's Trinity Church and prominent Episcopal communicates filled the ranks of the Empire State's government in the early Republic. And there doesn't seem to have been serious dissension among active churchmen about the limits of state power regarding the promotion of religion or religion's broader place in the political and social order. New York Chancellor James Kent, whose relatives would later play an important role in the promoting of Tractarian ideas in the United States, routinely argued that New York, and indeed the United States, was a Christian republic of Christian people with Christian laws, not particularly dissimilar in a religious context from Great Britain. When he upheld the 1811 conviction of for example, the 1811 conviction of John Ruggles for blasphemy. Ruggles had shouted in a crowded tavern that Jesus Christ was a bastard and his mother was a whore. The state condemned him to 3 months in prison and ordered him to pay a fine somewhere on the order of $10,000 to $12,000 in 2020 money. Kent dismissed Ruggles' assertion that the First Amendment protected his speech on the grounds of religious liberty, and Kent also dismissed his Ruggles' assertion that his rant represented a religious preference worthy of state protection. Kent argued that although the Constitution had discarded religious establishments, it did not forbid judicial cognizance of those offenses against religion and morality which, quote, had no reference to any such establishment or to any particular form, but are still punishable because they strike at the root of moral obligation and weaken the security of social ties. Americans stand equally in need now, Kent said, as formerly, of all moral discipline and of those principles of virtue which help bind society together. The people of New York, in common with the people of this country, profess the general doctrines of Christianity as the rule of their faith and practice. Kent declared that to scandalize the author of those Christian doctrines was not only, in a religious point of view, extremely impious, but even necessary to the obligations due to society, a gross violation of decency and good order. Kent's fellow justices on the state Supreme Court, a majority of them Episcopalians, concurred unanimously, and Ruggles went to prison. Episcopalian-led blasphemy trials represented lay episcopal maintenance of a historic Protestant social order. Episcopalians concerned themselves not only with law, society, and politics, but also with maintaining Protestant educational and vocational commitments. Episcopalians were among the earliest Protestant bodies that encountered educational change in the early Republic. The rise of the market economy and the presence of vocational schools elicited concern from bishops and rectors who feared parents would neglect catechesis and Bible classes in favor of education merely committed to vocational prosperity. Jonathan Mayhew Wainwright, the rector of Grace Church in New York and a future bishop, warned parents about the perils of prioritizing a capitalist-influenced vocational training over religious education. How differently, Wainwright told his congregants, are you instructed in the world? There you learn that advancement in the present life is to be the all-important object of attention. Secular education, he proposed, taught parents that they were to, quote, bring up your children in the nurture and admonition of the teachers of the useful and ornamental accomplishments, end quote. Worldly education told parents that they had to assiduously prepare themselves to make their way in society, and they would find esteemed amongst themselves the most successful and enviable, whose children obtained the largest portion of worldly honors and emoluments. Wainwright countered that religious education was broad-based and able to encompass some aspects of what was sometimes associated with vocational training. Religion, he argued, never remained merely spiritual. Episcopalians must not fall, he said, into the common error and consider religious education as in every sense opposed to that discipline which prepares an individual to act well in his part in social and political life. Religious learning did not obliterate vocational or political attainment. Religion, Wainwright argued, was the best groundwork for all the substantial requirements and all the graces of life. Erudition, knowledge, and accomplishment set forth religion and made it appear comely in the sight of men. Religious education's focus on the liberal arts in the early republic presumed that Christianity and even Protestantism was necessary to sustain a republican citizenry in society. Religion, argued Wainwright, prepared the way for every other kind of discipline and eventually ensured its success. Children educated in religious subjects will be dutiful and affectionate. Religious teachers will have made children virtuous and respected and happy to the utmost extent permitted in this probationary state of being. Anglican accommodation to the American political, social, and vocational order did not mean en masse affirmation of the Constitution's settlement over religion. Independence might have been accepted, and disestablishment might have been accepted. But the Revolution's aftermath and the nature of disestablishment remained sore subjects for Episcopalians well into the 19th century. There were no propers in the prayer book, for example, for Independence Day until 1928. That the debate continued to rage is evident by the fact that Bishop Bowen addressed the debate, or made clear he would not address the debate in his speech to seminarians in 1836. He said, "It is not to be supposed, my friends, that in contemplating the Christian ministry for your calling, you have not adverted to its condition in reference to the government under which we live. The question raging," he stated flatly, quote, "is not here to be touched, whether in its provisions where religion is concerned, the Constitution of the United States has been settled in the best and wisest manner that it could have been, as to an interest universally admitted to be vitally important to the civil state." He also said he was not going to address, quote, "whether in reference to that interest, the silence of the constitutions, in particular of the states, best consists with sound and wholesome policy," end quote. Bowen's refusal to take a side made it clear that the rightness of the Constitution's religious provisions were still a subject of spurious debate. It was enough, he told the seminarians, quote, "for us to avail ourselves of the freedom of action to which we are left, for the advancement of that interest according to our impression of the principles of which it consists." The bishop argued that they should rejoice, quote, "in any degree and manner in which they may see their abilities to minister to the happiness and welfare of their country." Jeffersonian disestablishment, even the First Amendment's religious provisions, were hardly sacred to early Episcopal bishops. As late as the 1850s, Episcopal rectors believed the United States government and particular states had overstepped the bounds of prudence and a rightly ordered society by stripping the Episcopal Church in particular of its historic civic and social functions and rights. John Norton, a Kentucky rector and the first biographer of Bishop William White, believed that a clique of godless politicians had set out to use disestablishment to harm Anglicans in particular. The Episcopal Church, he lamented, had scarcely begun to recover from the effects of past misfortunes when Jefferson and Madison set their dissenters on the church. Anglicans, he noted, could point to Washington and Jay and Morris and Madison and Marshall among her members as evidence that the Episcopal government harmonized most perfectly with the free institutions of the land, but that was not enough for Virginia's dissenters and their Jeffersonian Republican leaders. The leaven of opposition, Norton groaned, remained entrenched in Virginia. The children of those who had broken down the carved work of the sanctuary with axes and hammers had seized with unprincipled greediness on glebes and other temporal possessions. Finally, he lamented that this had been perhaps the fault of the Anglican Church themselves, because many of those who dispossessed the church, Norton warned, had grown up in the faith, but had been warped by the, we are to presume, Jeffersonian prejudices, quote, of their fathers. Thank you.
Well, once again, we've had another exercise of supererogatory virtue and are thus bang on time, I think. And we are therefore bidden to have our own internal discussion initially, before which we will then, after which we will then be open season to those who wish to ask questions from the floor. It's certainly very striking to me as I look back or think back to the three presentations that we've heard, being somewhat disposed in international relations terms myself to realism in several senses. It was really rather striking to hear in that first presentation the sense in which Mahan comes across as a realist, again in more than one way, and also, of course, his espousal of his espoused willingness to be a standout from the general consensus and the general coziness embodied in this enthusiasm for arbitration, upholding his own particular take on just war theory, and also, I think, exhibiting an awareness of just how oppressive moderation can therefore be. What came across there with the theme of arbitration was a sense in which you had a process of moderation that could nonetheless be found to be highly oppressive to those who didn't plan to advocate it. To merely take up one theme that emerged there. Again, to simplify grossly, it's extremely interesting, I think, from Professor Paul Marshall's take, to see the sense in which the US embodied freedom as a primary emphasis versus Canada recognizing a role for authority as reflected in its the continuing influence of the United Empire Loyalists and all that represented in the makeup of Canada, and therefore reflecting its overall ethos, which of course you might argue goes all the way down to someone like Trudeau, who would not see himself in any sense an Anglican, but the sense in which the Canadian gift for seeing a role for the state to impose moral order strikes me as something that Trudeau might find extremely congenial. And latterly, in the last presentation, we heard the term teeth and fangs mentioned, which I have to say has never really struck me as a particularly Anglican characterization. So I was therefore rather braced for stern stuff. However, it emerged, I suppose one might say, that in the end, Episcopalians were really emerging as a force for middle-class civic virtue and were promoting such things as decent education with a moral backbone, and in particular a religious one. You see that very powerfully in the way in which the Episcopal Church founded so many schools rather than colleges. And that's an interesting emphasis there, I think. But in a sense, it pointed also to the sense in which we are looking, or the Anglican tradition as it found itself in America, ended up looking for what you might call a soft establishment. Anyway, those are probably controversial takes to the speakers on their remarks. But I want to come back, as we begin our further discussion, to where we see the particularity of Anglican insight in what we are discussing. In other words, what examples would we point to of instances where particular policies have been advocated or played out which would not otherwise have happened aside from a particular Anglican insight? Now I throw that out for your discussions.
Firstly,
thank you very much. I just wanted to comment on something differently. The sort of radical difference in the sort of Canadian images of the United States in its earliest years and the South images of, particularly amongst the Anglicans, who regard themselves as standing for those very things which the Canadians were complaining were lacking. So I'll mention that out. Again, is there particular things we can point to? Again, if we're looking at a disposition, and a common shorthand often used is sort of America was established for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The equivalent phrase in Canada, Confederation, is peace, order, and good government. That sort of illustrates, again, that's just an ethos, it's not a doctrine so much. But I think that pluralism has been much more entrenched in Canada, of realizing all the different tendencies you have within there. For one thing, at its beginning, most of the people were speaking French. The Catholic Church was extremely powerful, so that then you allow very different things to operate in Quebec, and then as distinct from Ontario, Upper Canada, or the Maritimes. So you have pretty well everywhere two school systems, a Catholic one and a Protestant one. And and they were usually called the public schools and the separate schools. In Ontario and the Maritimes, the public school was Protestant, including Catholic, and the separate one was Catholic. Whereas in Quebec, the public schools were Catholic and the other ones. So as Canada secularized, there's been major attempts simply to erode that or destroy it, even though it is guaranteed in the Constitution, the preservation of those. So that plural emphasis, also dealing with English and French Canada, a practice, of course it goes on in the United States, trying to balance your political tickets, but alternating Catholic and Protestant prime ministers to the degree that that's feasible. So being very aware of these different communities which exist, the different peoples in Canada. I think there's been more pluralism that's shown in the fact that Canada has, I think, 11 official languages. And people are usually aware of only French and English, which are across the country. But in the northern areas, a lot of the Aboriginal languages have a particular legal status, and people should be able to get service from the government in those. So.
The question being sort of what's the unique Anglican offering to North America, at least in the United States. I think it's that Anglicans don't have a lot of social anxiety when they're dealing with policy. They're sort of not bringing, there is no Anglican John Witherspoon. There's no sort of Anglican hand-wringing over, can we do this? Can we not do this? You see, they just are involved in socio-political life. Maybe that's sort of a presumptive right they assume they have to it, but you don't see them struggling with the sort of questions over church and state, even that other Protestant groups do. Presbyterians have that debate, Baptists have that debate, even Methodists have that debate to some degree. Anglicans only have it. So I think that if there is an offering, it's a sort of confidence, sort of a divine right to rule America. And some people say, well, is that true? Well, there's a building just up the street here. It's called the National Cathedral. It's not a Baptist church. It's an Episcopal church. And so on some level, I think that's real. There's kind of this presumption that, yes, it's a disestablished order, but the Episcopal church is sort of the soft established church of the United States, and remains so in a lot of
Miles, I would agree with that 100%. And I'm even thinking, and I don't know if any of you who are lifelong Episcopalians had the same experience, but I can well remember my mother telling me when I was very young that we belonged to the most prominent church socially, and that, you didn't have to be established Episcopalians. Wow, we just were, and she also told me, when I asked, because I had a number of Roman Catholic cousins, and I didn't understand, the family dynamics then, how those extended family religious ties worked, and I asked my mother about it, and she answered with a sentence which I've never forgotten, because I was asking, like who is this Pope guy, and so on, and she just said to me, we belong to the same church as the Queen. She's the head of our church. Whoa, no argument for me. That closed it, the argument. But I think you're right that there's that, and there's been that going back to colonial days. Even in the colonies, like a couple of the New England colonies, where Congregationalism was established, and Anglicans are considered the dissenters, they always kind of have that self-confidence, and yeah, it's still today, and I'm sure millions of Episcopalians can give similar anecdotes about that.
I should hate to think that social complacency was the number one Anglican virtue, but there is more distinctive. But I have to say, when I first came here, I was a little shocked to be in an Episcopal church and to be merrily told, I think it was a sermon illustration, that there was a sense in which obviously one wouldn't want to take it too literally, but it was certainly, there was a history to the fact that Methodists were Baptists who could read, and Anglicans, Episcopalians were Methodists with taste. So it shows how bad that can get. Anyway, it's time, I think, to have more serious questions. Who will lead the charge? Please.
Hi, my question is about Canada and America, actually. It was so wonderful to hear, I'm Canadian, so it was so wonderful to hear what Canadians used to sound like, 100 years ago. I wonder, with so many debates now about debates between in politics, you have, I think someone mentioned integralists, and that's almost old hat by now, but other questions of authority versus freedom. In the face of Canada and America both seeming to have fallen so far from the ideals that they established long ago, how do we update maybe that debate, knowing what we now know about how both the more authority-centric model in Canada isn't what it used to be, and how the sort of liberty-centered model in America isn't what it used to
be. Canada, like the United States, has of course been secularizing for a very long time. George Grant, who I use, I think his most famous book was Lament for a Nation. It came out in '65. People said it was a call for Canadian nationalism. No, you don't. It's not a call for anything. Although you don't put lament in the title of a book as a call to action. He basically said Canada's over, it's finished. The things which gave it some distinctive character to the United States are now dead or dying. So Canada, looks so very like Scandinavia or Massachusetts North, and I think that Trudeau is I threw out a jibe for those hastenedness with the Canadian Constitution, and but at least Trudeau Senior was a very intelligent man. When I was struck, I wrote a couple of articles on this on the occasion of that truckers' strike or whatever. And I'm not sure how far back we go, but at least in the last 70 years, only two prime ministers of Canada have invoked martial law. It wasn't called that, it was the Law Measures Act, a revision, and then it's father and son. So here, I think, is the sort of, authoritarian streak here, the push for authority. So I think, in a negative sense, Canada's push for order in these contexts gets much more impressive, and you're getting a sort of state-imposed secularism much more rapidly even in the United States. So I think that's connected with the earlier respect for authority, which carries on even in a different kind of government. So.
May I ask you a quick follow-up to that question? I remember some years ago now reading about whether, an ongoing discussion of whether Canadians would continue with the monarchy, and someone said, a Canadian said, they definitely will. They'll never get rid of the monarchy because that's the only thing that distinguishes them from America. And if they got rid of it, they would just turn into Americans.
Okay, I've been out of Canada for a quarter of a century, so I'm not sure of public opinion. Ephraim Radner, who is here, is maybe more in touch with what's going on in public opinion. I was struck by the fact I've read several articles which said this about Canada.
Okay.
And that surprised me, because I thought that Canada would be getting more distant, more Republican. And of course, in Quebec, often there's not a great desire for the monarchy, though historically they think that the monarchy had treated them fairly well. They had more or less a self-governing society in there. So, I'm reading things which says that's the case, and it surprises me. But usually if you ask Canadians what differentiates them from the United States, it's the health service. I'm absolutely serious.
This is a question for all of y'all. In an age of declining institutions and declining social trust, which corresponds roughly to that, what is the role of the shared Anglican Episcopalian virtues of obedience, of kind of joining in to establish social orders, etc.?
So I take the question means sort of what does the particularly Anglican idea of submission mean, maybe? Is that fair?
I was thinking a little more broad than that.
Okay.
Anglicans didn't develop colleges, they went to the colleges of the nation, they saw themselves as the leaders of the nation, and joining existing social institutions, or building broadly public ones. We are not by nature sectarian in any sense. So in an age in which large, broad public institutions are in decline, how do we respond to that? Like we have 2 Anglican churches in the country. What does it even look like in an instance of that?
So I think it's to be determined. This is the first time there's ever really been a post-Anglican society. And it's never really happened before. And so I think that we'll find out in the next generation. Anglicans are sort of having to live the life of Baptists and Methodists, right? We're having to figure out how to sell ourselves as a social institution as much of it as a churchly one. As democratization and I think disestablishment, they take a while. I think that's one of the reasons why I tend to think it's overstated. Disestablishment gets overstated in the early 19th century. Because, the churches have been removed from their sort of this deep institutional control, but they're not removed from people's hearts and minds. People kind of knew, okay, I'm prominent, I'm going to go to the Episcopal Church. When Andrew Jackson's niece moved to the White House to be the First Lady, she didn't go to the Presbyterian Church with him. She went to the Episcopal Church because she knew that was the respectable one, and that's the one the First Lady should go to, which infuriated her uncle. But there's sort of, we're living this now. We're downstream from disestablishment, and we're just now, I think, really feeling the reality of it. So I know this is kind of a cop-out, but I think it's to be determined. We just won't know yet, because this establishment in our hearts and minds has taken a while.
No one's really brought this up yet, and I know obviously a lot of people here have connections with IRD, and that's the sort of the disjunction between the laity and the clergy, often going in two separate directions, where I'm reluctant to generalize too much, but Anglicans of a more conservative nature, whether politically or theologically or both, see much of the clergy, diving in, I'm mixing my metaphors here, going full speed ahead into secularism, and becoming kind of a nice, respectable sort of form of that, keeping up outward symbols of respectability while going, whole hog into secularism. And obviously many of the laity are not, and some I'm sure we've all seen this. Some have just drifted away, maybe to other churches, or maybe not going at all. But they're still going to want their Episcopalian funeral, but they haven't been seen in the pews in years. Be blunt here, because they can't take it anymore. And it's not the Anglicanism or the Episcopalianism that they knew. So, that's an ongoing problem, and we'll see how that, that's also to be determined.
Okay, a bit of comment on this conference itself. I know the organizers wanted to, this a pretty latitudinarian conference that is getting a range of people in Episcopal and Anglican spectrum. I agree with Miles. We don't know yet. I think it was Sam Goldman who said predictions are really hard, especially about the future. But a few things have come up with John Milbank saying, we keep approaching things in terms of questions of rights and equality and then bureaucratic structures and rules. Says there's some place, obviously a place for those things is that fundamentally Christian. Nigel Bigger has raised this in his book on rights. At a time when, in my view at least, the US seems to be going rights crazy. You have all these disembodied people, well, not people anymore, disembodied souls who seem to be constrained by no external thing. Some sense of order and deference. Yeah, maybe you have a right to do that. But you'd be unreal if you didn't. Why not just say, I'm not going to do things which offend or upset other people.
May I add one more thing to that? And I think this impressed me in my research on Alfred Thayer Mahan. I hope this relates in some way to your question. He fully believed that Episcopalians as individuals, I think he would say to all Christians, but we're talking about Episcopalians or Anglicans, that is, as individuals, it's both their right and if God has given them expertise or whatever in certain areas, it's their duty to participate in the public square. And he knows that they will have different opinions on things. But that was fine. That was what he was doing his entire retirement years. And he often, one of the things I loved about him, he never hesitated to take on the clergy when he thought they were wrong. And he had that confidence that also came from having, in essence, close to a seminary education from his uncle, simply through reading lists of theology. So he was willing to take on any clergy, any bishops, and give them a point-by-point treatise of why they were wrong. And I got to say, I loved him for that.
One could argue, surely, that the tendency, which is been identified by some of our speakers, of the church to see itself primarily as an agent of social change, or again on the international stage as essentially promoting religion within the limits of Millennium Goals alone. These are a sort of form of collapse of where you end up if you are looking at all these questions from the perspective of seeking to provide or ensure a place for the church as a sociological phenomenon, rather than the legitimate voice of the church as informed by a theological perspective and underlying metaphysic. That was what was so striking to me, if I can just raise this question a bit, with the reference that we've heard from Milbank, to really go back to a much stronger earlier tradition, which affirmed a metaphysic, and we heard a lot, therefore, in that context about Richard Hooker. I just wanted to probe, therefore, is it a weakness of the American Church, or Anglicanism in general, that it inclines to be light on the metaphysics and theology, or is it simply that we're not currently making of the resources in the cupboard there all that we should?
Somebody else, I don't think about that.
I'll say that's a good question. Which is what you say when you don't know the answer.
Yeah.
Well, in that case, we'll have Mark Michaels to ask another question.
Question for Dr. Smith. What we might see now is about something that we might see now as the shadow side of this soft establishment. Thinking a few decades on from where you kind of ended your engagement, among the kind of major Protestant churches in the American Republic, the Episcopal Church really alone treated the abolition of slavery as the sort of third rail that shouldn't be touched. And as a result, it was the only major Protestant church in the Republic that did not divide. I'm just wondering if there's a through line between what you're talking about and that decision, which was really about, I think what most of us would say is the major moral question of the 19th century. And was there something in the way that Anglicans had negotiated, that the Episcopalians had negotiated their relationship to the state, in 1800, that made that the natural decision for them to make in 1850?
So I can kind of half answer Alistair's question and full answer your question.
The Episcopal Church was always much more sort of autocephalous by disposition than the Church of England or the Church of Ireland. I think because of that, even when the Tractarian controversy gets started, there's a lot more latitude in the United States than there is in Great Britain. You don't have the church cases to the same degree that you have in the UK. Stephen Eliot was the Bishop of Georgia at the beginning of the Civil War. And he actually argued, he said, okay, we actually aren't splitting off. When the Episcopal Church in the Confederate States was formed, he was very purposeful to say, this isn't a split. I happen to be the Bishop of Georgia. Georgia happens to be making this political decision. So therefore, this diocese is going to go along with Georgia. There's no split. There's no break in communion with the churches. So because the bishops had, I think, outsized power compared to what they have in England or in Ireland, you would get the ability to ignore slavery, especially in a place like Ohio. I'm thinking of Philander Chase and then Charles McIlvaine. Both of those guys are pretty loud abolitionists who don't talk about it a lot. In the same way with the bishops in Kentucky. So I think because the bishops have outsized power, they're able to ignore a lot more, say, than an individual presbytery in a southern or northern state in a Presbyterian church might, or even the Methodist Conference, which is much more acute to the laity, and certainly a Baptist church. So because the bishops are able to, they have the power to ignore things, they're able to ignore slavery much more successfully than other Protestants. So I'll hand it over to
I'd like to add to Miles' remarks. I think also, and you mentioned it, there's the Episcopalians and Anglicans have this notion, regardless of what country they're located in or what that country's government might be, there is this notion that we are in communion with each other, and some of the other Protestant denominations don't have that same view of it, or it doesn't mean anything to them, or mean in the same way. And I think that's also a reason. I don't know that they were so much ignoring slavery or overlooking it, but they're trying to deal in the respective states are all different, dealing with it on that level. Let me just add one more point about that. I talked very briefly about Alfred Mahan's uncle Milo, who was a professor at General for many years. He gave a speech. He got in a lot of trouble at General because he was wrongly accused of being a defender of slavery. He was not. He was against slavery. But he was a defender of the, say, individual dioceses have to make these decisions for themselves, and he did not want to see the church split, and he made a speech. I don't remember whether it was the New York State Convention or General Convention. He made a speech that was very controversial, saying, regardless of slavery, the Episcopal Church in America was not split apart. He did get some criticism for that, but it's interesting that he addressed that question.
I hesitate to interrupt, but recalling the language of teeth and fangs, I'm being looked at severely by Ryan, who wants me, I think, to point out two things, really. First of all, that we have, of course, among our sacred rites as Episcopalians and Anglicans, first of all, evensong, looming, and secondly, we have the nearest we get to Dionysiac, which is the reception. And so those loom, and therefore we have to vacate the space, and I therefore call upon you now, however, before we do that, to express our gratitude to the speakers in the House of Lords.